The camera was rolling when George Harrison threw down his guitar and walked out of Abbey Road Studios forever. It was January 10th, 1969, and director Michael Lindsay-Hogg was filming what was supposed to be a documentary about the Beatles recording their new album. Instead, he captured the most explosive band breakup in music history, Paul McCartney's controlling behavior, John Lennon's devastating criticism, and the moment when George Harrison finally snapped and quit the most famous band in the world. The footage was so brutal that it remained buried for over 50 years, too painful for anyone involved to watch. What the cameras recorded during those freezing January sessions wasn't just creative differences, it was the complete disintegration of four friendships that had conquered the world together. Paul pushing everyone to the breaking point with perfectionist demands, John making cruel comments designed to wound, George being dismissed as a junior member despite years of musical growth, and Ringo sitting in stunned silence as his best friends destroyed each other with words sharper than any weapon. If you love discovering the untold stories behind music history's most devastating moments, you need to hear this. Because sometimes the greatest bands don't end with grand gestures. They end with small cruelties, accumulated resentments, and the moment when love turns to poison in a recording studio where dreams used to be born. The Get Back sessions were Paul's idea, and from the beginning, that was part of the problem. After the isolated, overdubbed complexity of the White Album, Paul wanted the Beatles to return to their roots. Live recording, minimal overdubs, just four musicians in a room making music together like the old days. It was a romantic notion that ignored the reality. The Beatles weren't the same four young men who had recorded Please Please Me 6 years earlier. They were now individual artists with separate visions, personal problems, and creative ambitions that no longer aligned. John was deeply involved with Yoko Ono and exploring avant-garde art that had nothing to do with pop music. George had been studying Indian music and developing a sophisticated songwriting style that Paul often dismissed. Ringo was the steady professional, but even he could feel the tension that made every session feel like walking on broken glass. Paul set up the sessions at Twickenham Studios, a cold, impersonal film soundstage that felt nothing like the warm creativity of Abbey Road. The plan was to rehearse songs for a live album and television special, with cameras capturing everything for a documentary. But what the cameras captured was four men who could barely stand to be in the same room together. From the first day, Paul's controlling behavior was obvious and painful to watch. He would stand behind other band members while they played, offering constant corrections and suggestions that felt more like criticism. When George Harrison played a guitar part that Paul didn't like, Paul would physically demonstrate how it should be done, treating George like a session musician rather than an equal partner. "Try it this way, George," Paul would say, taking George's guitar and playing the part himself. "It needs to be more percussive, more driving." George's face in those moments was a study in suppressed rage. Here was a guitarist who had written something, and while my guitar gently weeps, being lectured like a beginner by someone who primarily played bass. The cameras captured every humiliating moment. John's behavior was equally destructive, but in a different way. Where Paul was controlling, John was dismissive and cruel. He would make sarcastic comments during Paul's songs, roll his eyes at Paul's suggestions, and generally behave like he'd rather be anywhere else in the world than making music with his oldest friend. During one particularly painful sequence, Paul was trying to work out the arrangement for Let It Be, playing the piano and singing softly. John interrupted with mocking commentary. "Oh yes, very nice, very religious. Are we saving souls now, Paul?" The cruelty in John's voice was unmistakable. This wasn't friendly teasing. This was designed to wound, and from Paul's expression, it succeeded. But it was George who bore the worst of the dysfunction. As the youngest Beatle, George had always been treated as the junior member, but by 1969 he was 26 years old and had proven himself as both a musician and songwriter. Yet Paul continued to treat him like the teenage guitarist who had joined the band 8 years earlier. The breaking point came during rehearsals for Two of Us, a gentle acoustic song that Paul had written. Paul was showing George a specific guitar part, but his instruction quickly became condescending micromanagement. No, that's not right, Paul said, stopping the song. You're rushing it. It needs to breathe more. Like this. Paul took George's guitar again and played the part with exaggerated emphasis, making George look incompetent in front of the cameras and the other band members. George's patience, which had been strained for months, finally snapped. I'll play whatever you want me to play, George said, his voice tight with controlled anger. Or I won't play at all, if you prefer. Whatever it is that will please you, I'll do it. The sarcasm was devastating. Paul tried to backtrack. I'm not trying to be difficult, George. I just want it to sound right. Everything has to sound like you want it to sound, George shot back. Maybe the rest of us have ideas too. Maybe the rest of us know how to play our instruments without your constant instruction. John, instead of mediating, made things worse. George has a point, Paul. You've been rather bossy lately. Paul's face flushed red. I'm trying to keep this band together. Someone has to make decisions. Someone has to push for quality. If that makes me bossy, then fine. I'm bossy. No, George said, standing up from his amplifier. You're not keeping the band together. You're tearing it apart. What happened next was captured in excruciating detail by Lindsay-Hogg's cameras. George Harrison, the quiet Beatle who had endured years of being overshadowed and undervalued, finally said what he'd been thinking for months. I'm leaving the band, George announced, his voice steady but filled with pain. I'm done with this. I'm done being treated like a hired musician in my own group. The silence in the studio was deafening. Ringo looked shocked. John seemed almost relieved. Paul appeared genuinely stunned, as if he couldn't believe his controlling behavior had actually driven away one of his oldest friends. George, come on, Paul started. Let's just... No, George interrupted. I've had enough. I don't want to do this anymore. Find another guitarist. I'm sure you already have someone in mind who will do exactly what you tell them to do. George unplugged his guitar, carefully placed it in its stand, and walked out of Twickenham Studios. The cameras followed him to the door, capturing the moment when the Beatles effectively ended, not with a dramatic announcement or a press conference, but with one member simply refusing to tolerate being diminished any longer. After George left, the remaining 3 Beatles sat in awkward silence. The cameras kept rolling, documenting their stunned faces and the terrible reality that their creative partnership might actually be over. Well, John finally said, with characteristic dark humor, I guess we should have been nicer to him. Paul was devastated, but tried to minimize the situation. He'll be back. George just needs to cool down. We've all been under a lot of pressure. But Ringo, who was closest to George and understood his frustration better than the others, wasn't optimistic. I don't think he's coming back, Paul. Not unless some things change around here. The sessions continued for a few more days without George, with Paul trying to maintain normalcy, and John becoming increasingly disengaged. The footage from this period is some of the most depressing in rock history. 2 friends who had once finished each other's musical thoughts, now barely able to communicate without hostility. Paul brought in Billy Preston, a talented keyboard player, partly to fill the musical gap left by George's departure, and partly to ease the tension between him and John. Preston's presence helped temporarily. He was a skilled musician and a calming influence, but he couldn't solve the fundamental problems that were destroying the Beatles. After 5 days, George agreed to return, but only under specific conditions. No more sessions at Twickenham, no more documentary cameras during private band discussions, and a fundamental change in how decisions were made. Paul agreed to these terms, desperate to keep the Beatles together, but the damage had been done. When sessions resumed at Abbey Road Studios, the atmosphere was different, more professional, but less intimate. George's Walkout had established that none of them were indispensable, that the Beatles could actually end if they didn't treat each other with respect. It was a sobering realization that changed the dynamic permanently. The footage of George's Walkout became legendary within music circles, though it wasn't widely seen by the public for decades. Those who did see it were shocked by the raw emotion and genuine anger displayed by usually controlled musicians. It was clear that these weren't just creative differences. These were deep personal wounds that had been festering for years. Paul later admitted that watching the footage was like seeing a marriage fall apart in slow motion. He recognized his own controlling behavior and how it had contributed to the band's deterioration, but the acknowledgement came too late to save the Beatles. John's cruelty during the sessions haunted him for years afterward. Friends reported that John would sometimes watch the footage and wince at his own sarcastic comments, recognizing how needlessly hurtful he had been to Paul during a period when Paul was desperately trying to keep their partnership alive. George's Walkout became a template for how he would handle conflicts for the rest of his life. Direct communication, followed by decisive action when his boundaries weren't respected. He never again allowed himself to be diminished or overlooked in a creative partnership. The Let It Be album that eventually emerged from these sessions was a testament to their musical abilities, but also a document of their dysfunction. Songs like Get Back and The Long and Winding Road were beautiful, but they were created in an atmosphere of tension and resentment that colored every note. Michael Lindsay-Hogg's documentary footage remained largely unseen for over 50 years, considered too painful and personal for public consumption. When portions were finally released as Get Back on Disney Plus in 2021, they were carefully edited to emphasize the music and camaraderie rather than the conflicts. The raw footage of George's Walkout remained archived, too brutal for general audiences. Music historians who have seen the unedited footage describe it as devastating and heartbreaking, a real-time documentation of how creative partnerships can be destroyed by ego, miscommunication, and the inability to adapt to changing dynamics. The Beatles recorded one more album together, Abbey Road, but the sessions for that record were notably different. There were no cameras, minimal discussion of personal issues, and a professional atmosphere that prioritized completing the music over resolving their relationships. It was a dignified ending to their recording career, but it couldn't erase the damage done during those January 1969 sessions. The studio tension during the Let It Be sessions revealed something important about creative partnerships. Talent alone isn't enough to sustain a collaboration when respect and communication break down. The Beatles were still brilliant musicians in 1969, but they were no longer friends who trusted each other enough to be vulnerable in a creative space. Paul's controlling behavior, John's cruelty, and George's accumulated resentment created a toxic environment where creativity became secondary to interpersonal conflict. The cameras captured this dissolution in painful detail, creating a historical record of how even the most successful partnerships can self-destruct when the people involved stop treating each other with basic kindness and respect. The footage serves as a cautionary tale for any creative collaboration. Success doesn't immunize relationships against the corrosive effects of ego and poor communication. Sometimes the most important thing artists can do is recognize when their personal dynamics have become too damaged to continue, and choose to end things before they destroy the good memories along with the bad ones.